Kawede, my name is Atraqua, and I was born extinct. According to the Bible, God said in Mark 16, verse 5, "Go into the world and preach the gospel to the whole creation." As early as 1488, Catholic Bartholomew Diaz erected a cross in the Eastern Cape as land claimed for the Portuguese crown. Diaz followed the route of his predecessor, Diogo Cao, who reached Namibia and planted a limestone cross. After Diaz, da Gama in 1497 erected a cross at the Cape of Good Hope. In 1510, one of the most feared military commanders, the Portuguese Viceroy Francisco de Almeida, was also forced to flee, losing many men. In 1990, the South African Council of Churches and the South African Bishops' Conference adopted the Rustenburg Declaration, which read, "Confessions and forgiveness necessarily require restitution. Without it, confessions of guilt is incomplete. As a first step towards restitution, the Church must examine its land ownership and work for the return of all expropriated land from relocated to its original owners." Globally, Christianity has worked with every official and illegal system of oppression. Dutch colonies became spiritual battlegrounds as the Dutch Reformed Church struggled for the hearts, souls, and bodies of colonized people in the Cape Colony, Sri Lanka, New Jersey, the Caribbean, northern Brazil, and Indonesia. The Cape clergy and the Cape Political Council presided over all religious and civic issues. As the Cape became a human cargo and wine economy, churches became major landowners. Immediately upon arrival in 1652, the Heren 17 referred to themselves as Christians to differentiate between themselves and the godless heathen. The Republic of the United Nations consisted of Utrecht, Holland, Zeeland, Gelderland, Overijssel, Griezeland, and Groningen. Spanish rule of the Dutch ended in 1658 after an armed revolt for Dutch independence from the Spanish Empire. The Dutch War of Independence, also known as the 80-Year War, took place between 1568 and 1648. Portugal at that time was in a dynastic union with the Spanish crown after the secession of Portugal. Britain would often support the Dutch in their wars, but they would later become bitter rivals. The Dutch and the English were frustrated by Portuguese and Spanish imperial expansion through dominance of the seas. In 1602, the Dutch East India Trading Company, also known as the VOC and known locally as the Heren 17, a conglomerate of traders and independent Dutch companies, was formed. The Heren 17 was made up of tenders from Germany, Belgium, France, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. It was only in 1649, praising the fertility of the land and the health of the livestock and the friendliness of the locals, that an instruction called Remonstrantie was issued by the Dutch government to establish a colony at the Cape. Aiming to break the Portuguese monopoly on the spice trade, this instrument of war established its administrative office in Java, Jakarta, in 1610. 1588 to 1675, when their military became the most powerful and formidable maritime force, marked the golden age for the Dutch. The first fleet to the Caribbean set sail in 1599. In 1601, a fleet of 5 ships drove a fleet of 30 Portuguese ships from Bantam, Java. That marked a turning point in history. By the mid-1600s, the year 17 boasted a fleet of 150 merchant ships, 50,000 employees, and an army of 10,000 soldiers from the Persian Gulf all the way to Japan. They were autonomous floating states with the power to conquer, massacre opponents, wage war, strike its own coins, create a new colony, and coerce and break treaties with its proceeds of its atrocities, building a brand new Dutch economy. As multiple companies, syndicates, criminal gangs, and states competed for the silk and spice route, the cost of humans were incalculable. They trafficked more than 1 million enslaved people directly to Holland between the 17th and the 18th century. Dutch Reformed priests were followers of John Calvin. Calvinists were Puritans who believed that if they could destroy the false religions of the Catholic Church, they could embark on global conversion of Muslims and Jews, which would result in the second coming of Christ. Slavery was legitimized by spiritual authorities on biblical and theological grounds. The year 17 was obsessed with places of worship. Churches were often established years before congregations and communities. Baptism became a signifier of spirituality and decency, and a tool for excluding those not of Christian faith from society and economy. The radicalization of baptism was first raised in 1609 when Dominee Hulsebos, presiding officer in Jakarta, asked what happens to baptized enslaved people within Christian households. In 1618, a group of Calvinists from all over Europe assembled in the Swiss town of Dordrecht for their last international meeting. It was here where the future of baptized pagan enslaved people was first discussed. Dutch Reformed religious foundations originated after the 1618 Synod of Dort. One of the principles of the Synod were that enslaved people who converted to Christianity were to be set free and enjoy equal status with Christians. The guiding principles known as the 5 points of Calvinism was laid out in the Charter of the year 17. In 1609, Spain offered Holland peace in exchange for withdrawal of conquest and exploitation of the Caribbean. Holland was keen to access the Caribbean for cacao, sugar, and tobacco, and their occupation of Tobago was short-lived. West Indian Slave Company commissioned Calvinist Godfrey Oudemans to write a book justifying slavery. This ushered in the prosperity theology. All Christian clergy owned slaves. The theory developed that black people were created on the 6th day and were excluded from the Garden of Eden. Their looting was relentless and barbaric between 1602 and 1796. They made close to 5,000 voyages between Holland and Asia, killing and trading millions of humans, carrying spices, sugar, rice, coffee, metals, diamonds, gold, wild animals, sacred artifacts, and people for exhibition in museums, scientific experimentation, and human zoos. Dutch gluttony and prosperity were matched only by the horrors inflicted on indigenous people. In 1621, 1,600 Dutch soldiers, 300 Javanese convicts, 100 Japanese samurais, and a number of freed Batavians led by Governor General Jan Pieterszoon Koen, known as the Butcher of Banda, arrived upon a fleet of 13 large ships and 40 sailboats on the island of Banda. Banda is one of a cluster of 10 volcanic islands of eastern Indonesia, where most of the world nutmeg is from. The Bandanese was a flourishing Muslim community with lucrative trade in nutmeg and cloves. They traded with the British and Portuguese and transported nutmeg by ship to Java. Not only did the Dutch demand monopoly of nutmeg in the European markets, but also the route to India, where nutmeg was more popular. The year in 17 massacred the population of 1,500, divided the land, replaced the population with enslaved people and convicts from Batavia, becoming the monopoly in the spice trade. This paved the way for the Dutch Empire. The Dutch continued the extraction of nutmeg from Banda for more than 200 years until the land was completely depleted. Missionaries did not have any consideration for the religious beliefs of the Khoi and the San, which were complex and philosophical, and does not view nature as detached from the self. For indigenous people at the Cape, the European religious custom directly contradicts theirs and their beliefs. The lack of symbols for worship, clerical hierarchies, and other religious paraphernalia convinced the occupiers that indigenous people were without a god. The Christian occupier saw itself as an educator and civilizer. In order to do them both, they needed missionaries. Clergy arrived in the colonies with cultural bias and religious snobbery. Although they portrayed themselves as independent, selfless individuals risking life and limb to travel to foreign lands to save uncivilized beasts, they were imperialist informants sent to the colonies on condition of loyalty and were ruled by the intentions of their governments. Churches styled themselves as places of refuge where those driven off their land and strangled by brutality could have a fixed place of abode. Natives had no choice but to depend on Christians, a double-edged sword, to handle their grievances with the colonial masters. The Dutch Reformed Church became moral guardian and the reservoir for free labor. Christians prevented natives from participating in what they considered sinful demonic customs and rituals. The converted were forced to stay neutral in resistance wars. Christians pitted the converted against the heathen and played a huge role in the assault on traditional societies. The Christian condemnation and demonization of African customs and systems was of great benefit to colonization. For the colonizer, the imposition of European clothing was an assertion of superiority of all things European and a presumption of an eager acceptance of foreign cultures. This undermined the emotional and physical bonds sustained through these garments and caused deep-seated loss of spirituality, personal and communal dignity.